There's a couple of things we need to note that I think are very concerning. One is that our debt has been growing very rapidly until the recent much better performance by the current government. The second aspect of it, though, is surely that we're not so terribly far from being on a trajectory where we'd match up with those countries that lost control of it with a nasty shock. Yeah. That's what happens. Yeah. If you get in, it looks all right, and then suddenly it's not all right.
That's exactly what happened. So our figure, that figure of 20%, that's the Commonwealth's net debt as a share of the economy. If you add in the states and public enterprise and so forth,
let's be frank, particularly Queensland and Western Australia, the resource states.
Yes. Yeah, and a number of state governments also announced big plans to ramp up their debt, albeit hopefully to be investing in useful assets. But nevertheless, the more nearly national figure is about 30%, which is the more properly comparable one to places like America and Europe and so forth. You'd still say that's a lot lower, and that's comforting. On the other hand, first of all, those countries aren't nearly as dependent on foreign borrowing as we are, so they're less exposed in that sense. But also, that's about the level that many of those countries were at before the financial crisis. So the United States was at 35% net debt to GDP, the federal government, directly before the crisis, and then within a few years it was up at 75%, and now at 80%. So that's the thing, things can get out of control quickly, and that has all sorts of flow-on effects that unfortunately they take a long time to flow out, and so that means that the causality is difficult for people to identify. But one of the ways countries have handled that, and in fact many people now kind of may think, well, maybe debt isn't so bad, is because central banks have responded by cutting interest rates, cutting their policy rate, short-term interest rates so low. So you now have a situation in which you have negative interest rates for long-term bonds in many parts of Europe, extremely low rates in America, and now also in Australia, and that will have all sorts of long-term consequences. First of all, it tremendously undermines the incentive to save. The incentive for thrift and self-reliance is much reduced, which is a damaging thing, I think, in the long run. It's also undermined the incentive for governments themselves to get back into balance and start paying down some of those debts. At some point, someone has to repay those debts. But the trouble is, by having interest rates so low, the cost of holding those debts at the moment is very low, and so politicians, have to make a calculation. They have to say, do I take all the risks of trying to make the difficult decisions to actually reduce some people's benefits, or have to put off tax cuts or whatever to reduce that debt? Well, it's not actually costing me very much at the moment. Whereas in the past, in the 1980s, say, even the 1990s, when you in the early days of the Howard government introduced those tough budgets to try to remove the deficit, it was not only because there was an appreciation that you don't want to fall too far into debt, but also an appreciation that actually the interest costs were very high.
They were.
And so you had to deal with this. Central banks, unfortunately, one of the things they've done is they've removed that pressure. And so now, suddenly you find, unsurprisingly, that politicians all around the Western world, indeed all around the world, are starting to discover that maybe they don't want to take those difficult decisions. It's very bad in the long run.